Imagine building a company for, I don't know, 20 years. You just pour your absolute heart and soul into it.
Right, your entire life, basically.
Exactly. You finally sell it for, say, $10 million, dollars, and you wake up the next morning with this massive bank account, and you just immediately sink into the worst depression of your life.
Yeah, because you have absolutely no idea who you are anymore.
Right. And I mean, statistically, this happens all the time. We spend decades learning how to build, how to grow, how to scale a business.
But we are just completely emotionally and financially illiterate when it comes to the actual mechanics of walking away.
Which is exactly the mission for this deep dive. We are looking at why leaders struggle to leave, and more importantly, how to actually do it right.
Yeah, it's a profound, honestly, almost silent crisis in the business world.
Mm,
Founders and leaders excel at generating value, but, the skill set required to create something.
is entirely different from the skill set required to transfer it.
Exactly. Transferring it successfully to someone else is a whole different ballgame.
And our sole source for this journey today is this really highly practical workbook by John F. Hendershot. It's called Don't Turn Off the Lights, a practical workbook for business owners preparing to exit well.
It's such a great resource.
Hmm.
We will be moving from the emotional side to the deeply analytical today.
Right.
So we're exploring the psychological trap of owner identity, the cold, hard math of valuation.
Which is brutal, by the way.
Oh, absolutely brutal. And we'll get into the hidden risks that blow up negotiations at the last minute and the actual mechanics of how wealth changes hands.
Okay, let's unpack this because the very first distinction Hendershot makes is about the stark difference between a forced exit and an intentional one.
Right, yeah.
He basically argues that most owners wait until they are completely emotionally compromised to even entertain the idea of stepping away.
Because they're addicted to it, right.
Yeah.
They delay because they're just addicted to solving those day-to-day problems.
Yeah, but that unmanaged pressure of the day-to-day, it eventually accumulates into just pure fatigue.
And Hendershot calls this a burnout exit.
Right.
A burnout exit is entirely reactive.
Right.
The owner just wants the pain and the pressure to stop. So they accept incredibly unfavorable terms, or worse, they literally just shut the doors.
Just to escape the burden of leadership. It's the equivalent of bailing out of a moving car just because you're tired of driving.
That is a perfect way to look at it.
Like, you might get out of the vehicle, sure, but you are going to get incredibly scraped up, and the car is going to crash. You destroy the value of the asset just to get some relief.
Yeah, and contrast that visual with what the workbook defines as completion.
Okay, completion.
Completion is an intentional, measured transition. You aren't bailing out of the car. You are safely pulling it into a parking spot, turning off the engine, and handing the keys to someone who actually knows how to drive it.
Right, you are actively protecting the value you spent years building.
Exactly.
But, I mean, let me push back on this a little, because if you built it, shouldn't you care the most? How exactly do you separate your self-worth from something you essentially birthed into the world?
Well, Hendershot actually calls this the identity problem. It's where the line between the owner and the business becomes completely blurred.
Like they are one and the same.
Right. If you are the business, stepping down feels like disappearing entirely.
Wow. Yeah, that's heavy.
And what's fascinating here is how that emotional attachment actually weaponizes negotiations against the seller.
Really? How so?
Well, a business has a measurable structural value based on numbers, right? But that value is not your personal worth as a human being.
Right, right.
So if a seller hasn't decoupled their identity from the enterprise, they take the entire due diligence process personally. When a buyer points out a flawed operational process or, questions the profit margins.
The owner feels like their actual character is being attacked.
Exactly.
Which inevitably leads to defensive, totally irrational decisions. Like, they might walk away from a highly lucrative deal just because their ego took a hit.
It happens all the time.
This is why the source is so adamant that mental preparation has to happen long before financial preparation.
Yep.
If you don't know who you are without the title of CEO or founder, you will subconsciously sabotage the exit.
Absolutely.
And for you listening, I mean, even if you don't own a company, this applies to literally any major leadership role. If your entire identity is wrapped up in your job title, moving on to your next chapter is going to trigger an existential crisis.
Yeah, and that identity crisis often leads to the core concept of the workbook's title. When an exit is driven by burnout and ego, an owner often just turns off the lights.
Meaning they just shut it all down.
Right. They liquidate the inventory, close the accounts, the employees lose their jobs, and decades of community value just evaporate.
But an intentional exit allows you to pass the torch. The business continues to serve customers, employees keep their livelihoods, and the equity is actually transferred.
Exactly. But moving from turning off the lights to passing the torch requires shifting from the owner's emotional perspective to the buyer's ruthless mathematical one.
Oh man, yeah. Because the buyer does not care how many sleepless nights you had in, like, 2018.
Not at all.
They don't care about your emotional attachment or all the sweat equity you put in. They are buying future cash flow, period.
Right. And for smaller owner-operator businesses, buyers measure that cash flow through SDE.
Which is seller's discretionary earnings, right?
Correct. This captures the total financial benefit a single owner gets from the business. It combines net income with the owner's salary and all those personal expenses they run through the company.
Sure. And for larger operations, buyers obviously pivot to EBITDA.
Right. But they aren't just looking at standard EBITDA. They are looking for adjusted EBITDA.
Meaning they strip out the weird owner quirks.
Exactly. They remove the owner-specific quirks to focus purely on what the operational profitability looks like if a standard professional management team were running it.
Makes sense.
So once they establish that baseline earnings number, they apply a multiple to it to arrive at the final valuation.
And that multiple is like the holy grail, right?
It is the single most important variable in the entire transaction, and it is driven entirely by one factor.
Risk.
Risk, exactly.
Here's where it gets really interesting. You can have two businesses sitting right next door to each other. They have the exact same revenue, the exact same profit margin, but one will sell for literally twice as much as the other.
Yep. It sounds crazy, but it's true.
Hendershot calls risk the invisible value killer. And he points out two massive red flags that just destroy a valuation multiple.
Customer concentration and owner dependency.
Let's break those down.
Well, customer concentration is just simple math. If 50% of your revenue comes from just 2 mega clients, a buyer looks at your ledger and realizes that if one of those clients leaves,
The entire business basically collapses.
right, so they will drastically lower their offer or structure it heavily in their favor to protect themselves against that concentrated uncertainty.
But then there's owner dependency, which is a risk that founders are notoriously blind to.
Oh, completely blind.
Because the founder feels like a superhero. They step in and save the day. They hold all the key vendor relationships. They intuitively know how to fix the machines when they break.
But to a buyer, that superhero complex is terrifying.
Right. It is like trying to sell a used car, where the engine only starts if the current owner sits in the driver's seat, pumps the gas exactly 3 times, and jiggles the key at a very specific angle.
Nobody wants that car.
Nobody is going to buy that car, no matter how shiny the paint is on the outside.
Because buyers are essentially pricing risk.
Yeah.
They're asking themselves, if I write a check for this company today, what are the chances the revenue drops tomorrow?
Yeah.
And I want you, the listener, to think critically about your own workflows right now.
Oh, this is a good exercise.
If you were forced to go on vacation for 30 days with absolutely no phone and no email access, what would break?
Everything.
Right? Would high-level decisions still get made? Would new clients get onboarded?
Most people listening are probably breaking out in a cold sweat just imagining that scenario.
Because if the operation grinds to a halt without you, a buyer isn't acquiring a scalable system.
They're just buying themselves a highly stressful job.
Exactly. Buyers heavily discount any enterprise where the institutional knowledge is just trapped inside the founder's head.
So if owner dependency and concentrated risk are actively destroying your valuation, the obvious requirement is to build systems that eliminate those risks before you ever even talk to a broker.
Right. And Hendershot frames this as bridging the value gap.
The value gap.
Yeah, it's the financial canyon between what your business is worth today, burdened by all its hidden risks, and what a buyer would pay for it if it were fully optimized.
Okay, so how do we close it?
Closing that gap requires overhauling the business across 5 specific categories, which Hendershot calls the 5 drivers of business value.
Which are predictability, scalability, profitability, market positioning, and transferability.
Right.
We need to break those down because they are the actual blueprint for passing the torch. Let's start with predictability. That's about revenue streams, right?
Yes, exactly. A business that relies on ad hoc, one-off projects is inherently riskier than a business with recurring subscription revenue or long-term contracts.
Because predictable revenue lets a buyer actually sleep at night.
Exactly. Then there's scalability, the second driver. This asks if the business can handle a massive influx of new customers without the foundational systems just completely breaking down.
Right, like if doubling your sales means you have to hire twice as many managers and rent twice as much warehouse space, your scalability is poor.
Right. Then you have profitability. And buyers aren't just looking at gross margins. They really want to see operational efficiency that outpaces the industry standard.
Makes sense. And market positioning is about your competitive moat, basically. Are
Mhm.
you a price maker offering something so unique you dictate the market, or are you a price taker just competing in a race to the bottom on price?
Exactly. Which brings us to the fifth and most difficult driver.
Transferability.
Yes. This is where you have to perform a literal brain extraction.
Hmm. Sounds painful.
It is. Every intuitive decision you make based on a decade of experience needs to be documented, standardized, and turned into a repeatable process that a newly hired manager can follow without calling you on a Sunday.
And Hendershot stresses that optimizing these 5 drivers takes a 3 to 5 year lens. But I have to push back on that timeline a bit.
Okay, why?
3 to 5 years feels exhausting. Like, why can't I just hire a ruthless accountant, clean up the books for 6 months, write down some standard operating procedures for the staff, and just slap a for sale sign on the door?
Well, this raises an important question, and
Yes.
honestly, it is where the majority of founders completely blow their exits.
Really?
Yeah, you cannot just clean up 6 months of data because sophisticated buyers do not buy snapshots. They buy trends.
Ah, they want to see the whole movie, not just a photograph.
Exactly. They want to see years of clean financial history. They want proof that your newly appointed management team has hit their targets for multiple consecutive quarters, not just since you decided to sell last Tuesday.
Right. You cannot fake operational stability.
No, you can't.
You are proving that the machine works independently of you, not just that you gave it a quick, fresh coat of paint. And part of proving that machine works is achieving absolute financial clarity. Clean books win deals. Period.
Always.
The workbook also dives into the contentious issue of ad backs, which is where negotiations often get incredibly tense, right?
Oh, yeah. Ad backs are a battleground.
Because as an owner, you might run your car lease, your cell phone, and maybe, a family trip disguised as a conference through the business.
We see it all the time.
Right. And when you go to sell, you add back those personal expenses to the profit margin to show the true earning power of the company.
And legitimate ad backs are a totally standard part of establishing adjusted EBITDA.
Right.
But if those ad backs are undocumented, wildly aggressive, or just completely unreasonable,
You instantly destroy the buyer's trust.
instantly. If a buyer catches you playing games with your personal expenses to inflate the valuation, they will immediately assume you are hiding massive operational risks elsewhere in the company.
Wow. Okay. So say you put in the 3 to 5 years of work, you build the systems, you clean the books, and the business is finally a highly transferable, valuable asset.
You ready to go to market?
But a product is only worth what a specific buyer is willing to pay. Let's look at who is actually shopping in this market and how the money actually changes hands.
Sure. Hendershot identifies 4 main categories of buyers. And you really have to understand that each one evaluates your life's work through a radically different financial lens.
Okay, who's first?
First, you have strategic buyers. These are usually larger companies in your exact industry looking to expand their footprint or acquire your technology.
So like a competitor buying you out.
Exactly.
Okay.
And they often pay the highest premium because they can plug your operations into their existing infrastructure and immediately eliminate duplicate costs like HR and marketing.
Oh, right. That makes sense. Then you have individual buyers.
Yeah.
These are people who are essentially looking to buy themselves a job, right? They want to be the new owner-operator.
Right. And because their personal livelihood is on the line, they're usually much more cautious and focus intensely on transferability. They need to know they can step into your shoes without tripping.
Third is private equity. And private equity is a completely different animal, isn't it?
Oh, entirely. They aren't buying your business because they are passionate about your industry. They are buying it as a financial instrument.
Right.
They look to apply leverage, strip out operational inefficiencies, scale it aggressively, perhaps bundle it with 3 similar companies.
And sell the whole package in 5 years.
Exactly. They rely heavily on data and usually demand that your existing management team stays in place because PE firms are investors, not daily operators.
Got it. And finally, you have internal transitions. This is selling to your key employees, your management team, or your family members.
Right.
This route protects your legacy and rewards the people who help you build the company, but it comes with unique financial constraints.
Yes, it does.
Which brings us to a massive reality check from the workbook. The structure of the deal often matters way more than the actual purchase price.
This is such a crucial point. A high purchase price with terrible terms is just a trap. A lower price with clean terms is often the far superior deal.
So what does this all mean when the lawyers actually get involved? Let's break down these deal structures.
Let's do it.
The absolute dream is cash at close. You sign the documents, the wire hits your account, and you walk away free and clear.
But unless you are dealing with a heavily capitalized strategic buyer, that is incredibly rare.
Right. You are much more likely to see seller financing.
And in seller financing, you are essentially acting as the bank for the buyer.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they pay you a portion upfront, and you take the rest in payments over several years.
Which means you are still carrying massive risk long after you hand over the keys.
Exactly. If the new owner mismanages the business and goes bankrupt in year 2, you might never see the rest of your money.
That is terrifying. And then there are earnouts, which honestly completely blew my mind when I read this.
Earnouts are wild.
An earnout ties a large portion of your payout to the future performance of the business after you leave.
Right.
It is the equivalent of a high school teacher getting their salary based on how well their students perform on a standardized test 5 years after they leave the classroom.
It's exactly like that.
You have zero control over how the new owner runs the company, but your retirement depends on them hitting specific revenue targets.
Yeah. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this is exactly why aligning with the correct buyer type from the very beginning is so critical.
How so?
Well, an internal transition with your loyal employees will almost certainly require heavy seller financing, simply because your staff doesn't have millions in cash lying around.
Right.
Conversely, private equity might demand an equity rollover, where they require you to keep a 20% stake in the new entity to ensure you still have skin in the game while they scale it.
Okay, so all of these structures get hammered out starting with the LOI, the letter of intent. It outlines the broad strokes of the deal.
Yeah.
But signing the LOI just triggers the most brutal phase of the entire process, due diligence.
Due diligence is a forensic audit. The buyer brings in their lawyers and accountants to look under the hood with a magnifying glass.
It sounds awful.
They verify every single tax return, every vendor contract, every employee non-compete. If you claimed your business was a well-oiled machine, this is where they try to break it.
And Hendershot makes it clear that deals rarely fall apart because the initial price was wrong. Deals die in due diligence because of hidden deal killers.
Yes. The buyer finds undocumented liabilities, a sudden dip in quarterly revenue, or they realize the business actually is entirely dependent on the founder.
And when a buyer finds a surprise, trust evaporates instantly.
Instantly. They will either aggressively renegotiate the price down, or they will just walk away.
But losing control of a negotiation doesn't happen because the buyer is inherently predatory, right?
No, not at all. It happens because the seller is reacting to surprises rather than operating from a place of prepared strategy.
Ah, preparation is key.
Right. If you spent the last 3 years building systems and cleaning your books, due diligence is just a boring verification process. If you didn't prepare, it is an absolute minefield.
Okay, so let's fast forward. You survive the minefield of due diligence.
Yeah.
The legal documents are signed. The wire transfer clears. You officially hand over the keys.
The transition is complete.
But the deep dive isn't over because Hendershot warns that the true test of leaving well doesn't happen at the closing table.
No.
It happens the day after.
The first 90 days post-closing are a psychological shock for almost every sounder. You wake up and the urgency is completely gone.
Yeah.
The constant stream of rapid-fire decisions, the daily dopamine hits of putting out fires, the social identity of being the boss, it all vanishes overnight.
You are just staring into an existential void. And if you haven't prepared for life after the business, that void breeds severe post-sale regret. You start second-guessing the entire transaction, not because the math was bad, but because you suddenly have absolutely no structure to your day and no outlet for your drive.
Yeah, and the final chapters of the workbook focus heavily on this phase, redefining your personal purpose and managing your newly acquired wealth wisely.
Because the transition is not over when the check clears.
Not at all. You have to intentionally design what comes next. Some leaders immediately jump into angel investing or start new ventures because they genuinely crave the chaos of building.
Right.
Others deliberately choose to take a sabbatical, reconnect with their family, or pour their energy into philanthropy.
But the crucial point is that your next chapter must be an intentional choice, not just a default reaction to the sudden boredom.
Yeah.
So if we synthesize all of Hendershot's guidance, the core message for you listening is this. Leaving well is an act of deep, methodical intention.
Whether you are selling a multi-million-dollar manufacturing firm, stepping down from a major nonprofit board, or simply transitioning to a new phase of your career. Preparation is the only mechanism that turns a panicked, messy exit into a lasting legacy.
You don't want to be the person bailing out of a moving car covered in scrapes and watching it crash.
No, definitely not.
You want to be the leader who parks it, turns off the engine, and confidently hands over the keys.
Exactly.
And I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over, building on this entire concept of transferability and systems.
Okay.
What if building a business with the strict intention of selling it tomorrow, creating flawless systems, empowering your leadership team, and making yourself entirely obsolete to the daily operations? What if doing all of that is actually the exact best way to run a business you intend to keep forever?